Recording. Great. So, welcome to the New Center for Research and Practice and to the seminar Queerness and Labor. This is the first of 4 meetings and this 1-credit seminar that we're going to have over the next 4 weeks at this time. My name is Ben Miller. I'm a writer and researcher living in Berlin. I am a doctoral fellow in global intellectual history at the Free University there, and my research focuses on the transnational intellectual and cultural history of queer movements. Before teaching here, I've also taught at the Humboldt University in Berlin, and academically, I'm fairly active also in the Sexuality and Political Economy Network at the Historical Materialism Conference. I'm also on the board of the Gay Museum in Berlin and a regular collaborator with artists and other folks who aren't academics. That's a big part of my research and my practice, speaking of research and practice. So just to start by going over a little bit the syllabus and what we're gonna do, can you just nod? You've all been able to get into the Google Classroom, see the syllabus, get the readings, all that's been working? Yes? Good. Good, we like that. So, basically, the seminar is divided into 4 sessions. Today, we're going to do some brief introductions, some brief kind of conceptual intro work, and then talk a little bit about, I'm going to sort of lecture a bit about sort of one kind of case study in terms of the history of the relationship between queer sexual identities and Marxian thinking about reproductive labor. Next week, we're going to do another history session with some readings and another talk by me on the connection between queer sexual identities. Again, we'll kind of trouble all these terms a bit as we move on today, but queer sexual identities and sort of concrete questions of labor organizing, union organizing. Then for the last 2 sessions with our guests, we're going to jump out of the history pool, but then we're going to basically do that same thing conceptually again. So Sophie Lewis is going to talk from her own current work, a really exciting book, Full Surrogacy Now, which came out from Verso this summer, about queerness and social reproductive labor and this kind of very concrete kind of social reproduction, which is like gestation and birthing itself. And then Michelle O'Brien, who's a really fabulous sociologist at NYU, grad student in sociology, I should say, at NYU, and who's also part of the collective that makes Pinko magazine, which is one of the really exciting new outlets of this kind of queer materialism or queer communism thing that's kind of happening now. Michelle will be talking about her research, which has to do with trans workers in New York City, and especially sort of the way that their kind of affective experiences in trans movement organizing affect their labor organizing in very kind of concrete ways. So that's how all of this is going to play out. So tonight what we're going to do is a little bit different than normally. So the rest of the sessions, is this anybody's first time at the New Center? Or have you all done this before? First time?
I've done it before.
You've all done it before. Great. Okay, so it's my first time at the New Center, but I'm still going to say all this stuff because I feel like I have to. All of you have to do presentations on one reading, and then which are 10 minutes, and then a 5-minute response to someone else's presentation. Because you didn't prepare them for today, we're going to spend the first part of tonight kind of going through the Lewis and the Kate Bill Griffiths readings in a kind of university classroom seminar style. I'm going to ask some guiding questions. We'll have a conversation about those readings probably for about an hour after we do introduction, so from about 20 past the hour until 20 past the next hour. Then I'm going to talk just at you for about 40 minutes, giving you the kind of case study from my work. And then after that, we'll have some discussion about that, and then go through the list of dividing up all readings next. Does that sound good? Yes? Yeah. So I would love to hear now your voices, and I'm sure you would love to stop hearing mine. It would be great to go, and we can kind of go in, wait a minute, there's one more of you. There's 2 more of you, you're all here, yay. Cool. So it would be great to go down the sort of list of you, and you can do this in whatever order, or I can call on you. Why don't I call on you, because then that'll be easier, and I can spotlight you while you do it. And I would love to hear who you are, what your kind of background is, like where you're coming at these questions from, whether that's previous study or professional experience, or just why you're interested in this, or why did this seem interesting to you. And then we can go from there. And if you could turn your video on when you're speaking, that would be great. And when I call on you, I will also spotlight you, which means that you will then be being recorded for the distribution of these lectures for the archive for all the members. So we're going to start with Jordan, who I am now going to spotlight. It works.
Hello. Great. Hello, everyone. My name is Jordan. I'm coming from Saskatoon, Canada, and I have an MA in sociology, and I'm more familiar with the kind of Marxist end of this conversation, though I have a lot of weaknesses there. And I was specifically interested in this course because I have kind of, for the most part, very little experience studying queer theory. So this was very interesting for me, as I'd like to, learn more.
Cool, thanks so much. Now, Sebastian, and if I pronounce your name horribly wrong, please just correct me.
Yeah, no, that was good. Yeah, my name is Sebastian, and I have formal training in art history and a bit of philosophy, and now I'm doing my MA in curatorial and critical studies in Frankfurt in Germany. And I've been engaging myself with queer theory quite a bit in this past 2 years, but mostly with the aspects of time, so queer temporalities, but also on the other hand, I've been thinking and researching a lot of about queer sociality and maybe how this echoes of the anti-social turn are still manifesting today or not. And yeah, this course attracted me because I think it's very crucial to think queer theory in relation to its very material manifestations, and how queer theory can also reenact certain, or be productive for certain politics that are very concrete. And yeah, that's me. Thank you so much.
So next comes Sasha.
Hey, I'm a bit frustrated with doing this introductory thing every class. So yeah, I'm a certificate student in the New Center, and I mostly come from the art background. So I have a really recent but quite ongoing interest in the theories of social reproduction, but I have so far I have mostly engaged with them in a more, I would say, traditional feminist perspective rather than a queer perspective. So I suppose this contribute to my thinking. That's it, I suppose. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, sorry to do this painful introduction thing, but it just, I need to know who you are. Sorry. We can try to make it fast. Alexei?
Right, yep. So hello, I'm Alexei. I'm from Belarus myself, but I did my master's in Helsinki in Finland. My master's in cultural studies. So basically I'm trained in decolonial and post-colonial things and gender studies, and I took a few courses on feminist epistemologies, so a little bit aware of what's going to be going on in this course. But I'm a new student at the New Center. Recently, I've been working with posthumanism more and new materialism, and I'm trying to take my research in a slightly different direction. So yeah, I'm very interested in this course.
Cool. And Mohammed.
Who still doesn't have video. I apologize in advance. That might be why it's not recording. I don't know if you can hear me though.
We can hear you.
Okay. So yeah, I'm from Qatar. I'm taking my MA right now at NYU, Experimental Humanities and Social Engagement. This isn't exactly directly related to my research, but it's just an area that I'm curious about and want to learn more about. So I come with almost little to no background in queer studies and kind of the conversations that we're going to be having. So I'm excited for that at least.
Amazing. Susie.
Hi, I'm Susie. I'm based in Lima, in Peru. My background's mostly in art and curatorial practice. I work at Transart Institute, which is a grad school for creative practice. I run the MFA program there, and I co-directed an arts organization here in Peru. I am also coming with very little background in queer theory and queer studies. So I was curious about this. I'm also particularly curious about how the question of queerness and labor overlaps with institutional practice and para-institutional practice, especially in the art realm. So that's kind of where my interest lies.
Amazing. And finally, William.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, was that a yes?
Yes, that was a yes.
Okay. Sorry, my computer camera is broken, so I have to use my phone as a second camera. But yeah, so I'm a certificate student at the New Center, and I'm trained in a BA in literature and a master's in media design, and I'm interested in transdisciplinary research and practice. And let's see, I can't claim much experience with sort of queer theory properly, although I do have some experience with like Jose Munoz's work. But I'm also, particularly in this class, I'm sort of interested in the way that identity is figured and critiqued. And I'm interested in sort of ubiquitous critiques of identity politics from sort of all angles and what gets erased by these sorts of interjections.
Cool. Well, thank you all for that. And sorry to make you sit through that, but I just have to, at some point, find out who you are, and now I know. So just to kind of give a broad introduction, very briefly before we go into Lewis and to kind of respond to some of the things that we just heard. I heard a lot of folks saying, maybe with a little bit of worry in their voices, that they're not, they don't have a lot of experience in or don't really feel on home turf in queer theory. I don't really think of this as a queer theory course per se. I think it's more a course of some case studies about how some things kind of relate to one another. And I think there are a lot of ways into it, but this is not going to be, we're not going to have, I mean, I can only speak for, no, I think I can speak for Michelle and Sophie too. I don't think we're going to be having a lot of really kind of intense or deep pulling apart or sort of thinking through of really kind of knotty questions of theory. This is fairly applied and kind of trying to think about some pretty concrete questions, of course, in kind of well thought through and intellectual ways. Susie, the thing you brought up about institutional practice is really fascinating. And if that's something that you find you're able to bring into any of the sessions, I'm about that, please tell me. Unfortunately, that's not something that I have planned at the moment, but I am also really interested in these questions and would sort of love to hear more. Does anybody know who's, it stopped, never mind, there was a strange rumbling. So the original conversations that I was having for this course with the folks who ended up asking me to do it, and this kind of jumps off the last thing that William said, was the idea of doing a course that was somehow queer, but against identity politics. And I said, well, the thing is, I'm not against identity politics. I think identity politics can be a perfectly useful beginning for something. The question that I always then have is kind of, what do you go through to? And so I guess the kind of orientation of this course, and this should become more clear as we kind of work our way through the Lewis text especially, is to think about queer identities and the question of social reproduction as kind of a door into the universal, and kind of the broader sort of epistemological rooting of the thinking, at least that we're doing in here, being of looking to the specific, but always in order to kind of find a pathway into something bigger. And I think the Lewis does such a good job of talking about this that I want to kind of turn to it right away. And so again, the work that we're going to do for the next hour or so with the Lewis and the Griffiths texts is not something that we're really going to do again, because this is going to be after today something that you all do with your presentations. But these three texts are really important in terms of kind of getting out the, in terms of getting concepts defined and kind of laying the groundwork for everything we're going to do in here. And so let's start with that first Lewis excerpt, which is the debates in Western gender politics on the top. It starts with the epistemology and identity politics section. And I'm going to unmute you all, if I could, because we're going to be trying to have a kind of a chat where we kind of jump in and jump out. Great. Great, so that should now work. So, 1 second, there we go. So, starting with the Lewis, and I'm just gonna kind of ask questions and sort of seminar-y, and we can talk, and if it gets off of my direction, then great, and if it doesn't get off of my direction, then it can stay on my direction. What is, as Lewis lays it out, the big kind of disagreement between Marxist thinking and identity politics? Feel free to jump in.
I think that it's because identity politics and Marxism are a little bit incompatible. Is that if we believe that in Marxism it works only if all share the same experience, is it?
Sort of, yeah. That's one.
We group according to the experience, basically.
That's kind of one piece of it. Does anyone else have kind of more on that?
I think that Marxist critique of identity politics would also be something, would be seeing them as something that are obstructing the way to talk about class, so somehow eliminating the class issue by making it all about the essence, or all about yourself, or about the individual as a group.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm having a technical issue. I'm trying to get it to do, give me one moment. I'm so sorry.
Yes, she also makes an interesting point, and I'm not sure it's exactly answering your question, but this point really made me wonder when she discusses and says that queer understanding of politics is merely located in the realm of the policing of language, and then she goes on to prove that this is kind of not enough, and this understanding of queer politics, I kind of felt that this is a bit reductionist, because I've been reading Jose Munoz alongside this, and he speaks about like completely different understanding of what queer is and what queer can be. And I wasn't sure which authors she's referring to, and I was kind of confused by this statement, to tell the truth.
Okay, did anyone else share that feeling? Because that's definitely something that I've heard. That's definitely something that I've heard other people kind of have as a reaction to this text. That kind of the view of, actually, you know what? Let me put that on ice for a second and just make sure that we get one thing. And then I want to return to that because I think that's really interesting, okay? You mind?
Yeah, okay, yeah, okay.
I'm just gonna hold off 1 second, just because I want to make sure that we get, and this is pretty crucial to what she's saying and also crucial to how I think, and kind of crucial to how I want to think in here. Oh, for Christ's sake. I'm sorry, I'm having further technical issues. I can't. Okay, let me just try. I'm just going to leave it like this, and it's going to be imperfect. You can all see me. Queer politics, as she defines them here, this kind of queer politics that she's talking about, radical queer politics, when she's talking about this kind of linguistic politics of deconstruction, that for her is separate from this other thing, which is radical feminist politics, which is based, which doesn't just mean feminist politics that are politically radical, but by radical feminist politics, she means like a specific strain of feminism that views the experience of being in a female body as being sort of the biggest fundamental driver of different kinds of inequality, various kinds of inequality. And for that, the kind of big overarching system that's being fought is patriarchy. And then there's Marxism, as she's talking about it, which is Marxism, but for her, all three of those things have different critiques of identity politics. Like the thing that's important in here, no one wants to be identity politics. No one, I mean, people do in the world, but in terms of what she's talking about here, like, it's not that she's critiquing queer politics, which are identity politics. It's that queerness has this critique of identity politics, which is that by fixing the subject anywhere, you're kind of, you know, do anything. Radical feminism has this critique of identity politics, which is no, our bodies are real, like our lived experiences are real. It's not something we just like claim. So it's kind of coming from the other side. And then there's the Marxist critique of identity politics, which is, as a few of you said, this idea that it somehow interferes with solidarity or turns away from the universal into sort of only thinking about these questions of the sort of hyper-particular, and that by dividing up the political subject in that way, right, by slicing it into all these different groups and claiming somehow that there can be no solidarity between them, or that they can't understand each other, or that there's some, you know, fundamental antagonism in there, they're kind of, it sort of splits all this up, and you can't build a subject that you need to make the kind of change you want to make. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Cool. So now I want to turn back to the way that she characterizes. Now I want to turn back to the way that she characterizes queer politics. Is that noise? If that noise is coming from you, please mute yourself. Thank you. So, did anyone else have the reaction that Sasha had? That what is she talking about? The politics are only about language. Was anyone else thinking that? Please speak up if you. I can't see you all at the same time, so speak up if you did have that reaction. Okay, so but it is. I mean, so that wasn't anybody. There's nobody trying to jump in. That is a pretty common reaction that some folks have, especially when you're talking about theorists like. Were you reading Cruising Utopia?
Jose Munoz.
Yes, but were you reading?
I was reading, Jose Esteban Munoz.
No, I know, but the book. Were you reading Cruising Utopia?
Yeah, utopia, yes.
Yeah. So Sasha's brought up a book by Jose Esteban Munoz called Cruising Utopia, which is very different, I think, from the kind of radical queer politics or radical queer theory that Lewis is talking about.
Yeah.
The Munoz text is in some ways based on or very fundamentally influenced by the 20th century Marxian thinker Ernst Bloch, and has to do with a lot of kind of very concrete questions of labor and social reproduction, actually in similar ways to this Lewis text. That Munoz text is part of my kind of archive of thinking about how to do this stuff well and not to fall into the traps she's thinking about. So again, just like when she's talking about radical feminism, she's not talking about all feminism. Just like when she's talking about radical feminism, and she's not talking about all feminisms that have some politically radical component. When she's talking about radical queer theory, she's talking about this sort of specific thing, which is this, as she puts it on page 25 of that reading, this kind of 1990s high linguistic turn, Heideggerian thing. Judith Butler is often the name that gets thrown around for this. I have no interest in particularly bashing Judith Butler. We're not going to talk about Judith Butler particularly much in this class, but I'm not opposed to what she did. But it's just, Lewis is just characterizing it as having a kind of different focus or understanding of kind of what systems are and how people work into those systems. What is, to kind of go back to you guys for a second, because I've been talking a lot, what is Lewis's problem? And Sasha started getting into it. Either Lewis's problem or kind of Marxist's problem, as she characterizes it, with that kind of queer theory. What are some of the epistemological conflicts that Lewis argues kind of come up when trying to think these things together?
Is it that she thinks that if system doesn't change through language and imaginary, like as post-structuralism and queer theory argue, nor does it change if we try to dismantle hierarchical relationships within the institution? Then she asks what Marxism can tell us to do, like about now.
Mm-hmm. That's part of it. One thing in general, sorry, before we move on to the discussion, if you are referring to the text, if you could always just say the page number, just so that everybody can kind of follow along with you. So what page are you reading from there, Alexa?
22.
You were on 22 there. Yes, I certainly think that's part of it. I would look a little bit earlier as well, because I want to kind of pull out what some of these epistemological differences are, especially as related maybe to the question of objectivity.
Yeah.
One thing that Lewis noted was the tension between Marxist and queer theorists in terms of kind of a favoring of situated knowledge over objectivity. And I think that she talked about that on the page 20.
Do you want to get into talking about situated knowledge a little bit more, and what kind of what is situated knowledge? What is objective knowledge? What does each one do?
Well, I think my kind of narrow understanding of it would be that situated knowledge is knowledge or information that comes out of kind of a more individual or small group lived embodied experience of the world. And then objectivity, I guess, would refer to a few different things, but probably focusing on knowledge that comes out of like a broad survey of a system or history or histories that assumes that coming to a truth that can be applied broadly to everyone and everything, in contrast to situated knowledge being kind of very specific to a particular situation or group of people or person.
Yeah.
Sorry, Sarah, keep going.
Sorry.
No, please jump in.
Yes, I'm on the same page there, and what I wanted to point out, what I found interesting in Lewis' arguments about objectivity, is the way queer theory and Marxism experience the system. And she points out that while Marxism assumes that, while a Marxist subject assumes that she is capable of understanding those cracks and cracks in the system, the queer political subject experiences the system as an overwhelming and inscrutable, alienating spiritual force. What I found interesting about this is that it is, for me, it is like really directly related to what the Xenofeminist Manifesto writes about, like our world is in vertigo, but has it ever been otherwise? But I kind of felt that she doesn't really continue with the thing, but it just like a note beside this thing, yeah. But it's a pity she doesn't. It was really weird that she doesn't put a footnote of where this, which authors she means when she speaks about this.
Mm-hmm. And I also think, I goofed when I gave you this PDF, and I don't believe I gave you her footnotes, and I apologize for that. All future readers.
Yeah, please do.
In there, I'm sorry. And I also am happy to distribute the footnotes for these chapters after this session. My apologies.
Yeah.
I just want to pause for a second before anyone else jumps in, because what Jordan said and what Sasha said are really important, and I just want to kind of lay something down as a kind of building block for this. Because what we're doing with the Lewis and the Griffiths is kind of laying down the building blocks for just how we're going to think about this stuff in the next few days. That, of course, doesn't mean that we can't bring in other perspectives, but just I'm trying to sort of lay down some common assumptions that are kind of happening in this world that I'm also in now about how to productively think queerness as this thing, right? And kind of Marxist ideas about labor as this thing together, and try to get them into some kind of productive synthesis. In terms of subjective, what's the word I'm looking for? Situated and objective knowledge in this context. There are seminars you can take at the New Center where people who are a hell of a lot smarter than I am will meditate for a very long time on what objectivity is and if it is possible. We're not doing that here. The point of this seminar, what we mean by objective, is in the context of queer politics and Marxist politics, or queer kind of epistemologies and Marxist epistemologies, which are all kind of ways of knowing or ways of organizing or ways of thinking that have at their core the ambition to make huge kinds of change in the world. Situated knowledge is knowledge that presumes that the kind of thinker of that knowledge or the subject of that knowledge is sort of thinking about themselves and thinking kind of from their position. And objective knowledge is knowledge that presumes to be able to at least attempt to understand, or that presumes to find it useful to understand whatever the system that is being changed is as a whole. And again, all these definitions are only internal. I am not a philosopher, and for the purposes of what we're going to do here, it's interesting to meditate, I think, on how some of these things relate to other kinds of questions in epistemology and ontology and all sorts of different fields, but that's not what we're going to be doing here now. At least that's not what I'm going to be doing, but please feel free to do it yourselves. Does that all make sense?
Yeah.
In terms of Xenofeminist Manifesto, it's interesting, Sasha, I'm actually not sure whether she wrote this before they did or they wrote it before she did. I know that she has some critiques of xenofeminism, but I can't remember.
Yeah, she does.
Yeah. I think that's interesting to kind of think through xenofeminism being a somewhat different. Is there anybody here is everybody here familiar when I say xenofeminism with what I'm talking about? I see shaking heads. Is there anybody know? No. So the Xenofeminist Manifesto is a kind of accelerationist feminist manifesto, and the Xenofeminists are an accelerationist feminist group, like a lot of, like Holly Lewis and a lot of kind of queer Marxists. They are against nature, unlike a lot of queer and feminist Marxists. They are quite accelerationist, quite focused on questions of technology in ways that for better or for worse, this kind of sexuality and political economy way of thinking that I'm coming out of isn't. And I think Sophie's session will be the place where we get the closest to xenofeminism here. So did anyone have anything else on situated and experiential knowledge, or can we move on? We can move on. So how does Lewis talk about kind of material conditions affecting intra-queer debates? So she lays out this way in which debates among queer people have been kind of affected by their kind of material position, their class position. What are some of the examples that she uses, and what do we think about those examples? There's this stuff on page 27 that's sort of what I'm thinking about. If anyone wants to pipe up, or I can talk more, that is also fine. I guess what I'm trying to get at here is this thinking that she does on how kind of debates about and between different kinds of queer and feminist subjects have themselves been kind of structured by their material position. So for on page 27, she talks about kind of conflicts between middle-class feminists who maybe were thinking about gender as a kind of false consciousness, who were thinking about the differences between men and women as being about a kind of bodily reality, and who considered masculinities to be, Lewis says, a form of social violence, and then a kind of queer critique emerging out of class queer and feminist folks who experienced having to perform gender by having to do gender different ways on the labor market to be legible on that market. Whether that be dock workers, secretaries, waitresses, showgirls. One really interesting thing that I heard, I'm talking about next week, my lecture is going to be about a political conference in Oregon in the 1970s where a bunch of gay men talked about socialist feminism and labor organizing and how they thought it sort of related to their kind of activism and their struggles. And I was talking about this work at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and one of the points that was made there was that, or at the conference in the 70s rather, that sissies, gay men there who were more effeminate, who identified as more effeminate, talked about how they had a really hard time on the labor market and they were kind of undervalued. And I wondered if that had something to do with undervaluing of femininity on the labor market more broadly. And then was speaking to someone afterwards who just done research on trans histories, and in fact, in the 1960s and 1970s, in lesbian couples where there is a butch and a femme partner, so one partner who's more masculine presenting and identifying, and one partner who's more feminine presenting and identifying, the butches at that time always, especially at this point in the 20th century that Lewis is talking about, where these queer debates are emerging, there's this kind of gender nonconformity haircut that people are taking in terms of their value on the labor market, and that really affects kind of how and who thinks about what kinds of politics as being important to them. The other thing that I want to say in terms of the relationship between kind of material conditions and evolving queer politics and identities is, I didn't give you this as reading because it's pretty simple to explain, but I want to lay out a framework for thinking about the evolution of queer identities in concert with evolving regimes of production and exchange that comes from the work of Peter Drucker, and I will email you all the link to, or the sort of citation for his book. The book is called Warped. It came out from Haymarket Books a couple of years ago. But what he talks about, and this is kind of a big, broad argument, but just to summarize where we are now at this kind of moment, both of our history sessions are going to focus on the 20th century in the developed capitalist economies of the world. And then the contemporary sessions are going to be about today. In the 20th century, Drucker argues, and this also echoes arguments that are made by George Chauncey in his book, Gay New York. And John D'Amelio, who wrote an essay called Capitalism and Gay Identity in the 1980s as part of the gay academic Marxists circle, that kind of started a lot of the tradition of historical thinking that I kind of identify with, or find myself in, and find useful. Drucker's framework is that the kind of imperialist mode of production and exchange of the late 19th and early 20th century is associated with a scientific a sort of racial regime of explicit scientific racism, right to the idea of eugenics or stages of man, or whatever you want to call it, that there are these kind of subaltern people. These are these sort of people who are there to be colonized, and they're half nature, and they're on the wrong side of the Cartesian split, and they're not really humans, and that. And that those things are associated with a regime of sexuality. And by regime of sexuality, he means the way that sexual identities are kind of organized and make sense to other people, where the same-sex sexuality is organized around the figure of the invert. There is an invert. The invert is, and this is kind of that, if you're thinking in a Foucauldian way, this is kind of that mythical homosexual that gets born in 1870 or whatever. This invert is penetrated. This invert is, if male, effeminized. And the partners with whom this invert has sex are not necessarily coded as homosexual or inverts or whatever. So the invert goes down to the docks and meets various normal men, and only the kind of penetrated partner is homosexualized. And then as after World War II, and as in the developed economies of the West, we move into a kind of Fordist system of production and exchange in these kind of post-war years of the 50s, 60s, 70s, even a bit into the 80s, there becomes, in these Western countries, what becomes dominant is, first of all, a model of kind of racial liberalism in which various movements for racial equality begin to be kind of accepted, at least on official terms. That, of course, does not mean that racism goes away. That, of course, does not mean that governments are not producing horrifyingly racist policies all the time. It's just to say that the kind of discursive, what becomes discursively dominant is a kind of racial liberalism. And the regime of sexual identity that becomes dominant is what Drucker calls gay dominant. And that's where we start having people actually identifying as gay or lesbian. And what they mean by that is that they're going to be in a relationship of relatively equal power differential with another person. Both of them, regardless of their gender presentation, are coded as being gay or homosexual or whatever. And so it's no longer this kind of receptive figure whose partners are not also coded as such, but it's actually this kind of, it becomes both partners. And that's the kind of moment in which these evolutions that Lewis is talking about are happening, and that's the moment in which the history that I'm going to be talking about this week and next week is happening. Does that make sense to anybody? Are there any questions about that? Not hearing any, I'm going to ask if there's any more questions, comments, or concerns about that first Lewis excerpt. Questions, comments, malfunctions, problems, open wounds. Cool. So let's move on to the second excerpt from Lewis. And I want to begin by asking if anyone can lay out, as she argues it, what is the sort of Engels position on social reproduction, and how is that important, Lewis argues, for kind of early feminists?
Well, I think he is the first important or crucial Marxist thinker. That's weird to say for Engels, but like in this vein, that talks about reproduction that is not, that talks about social reproduction that is taking place outside of the labor market, so kind of like domestically. And he talks about how women are mainly obliged to perform this labor, and the reproductive labor that they are not remunerated for. Yeah.
I think Engels becomes very important for people who want to talk about that unremunerated reproductive labor, but he doesn't quite get there yet. There's this thing Lewis says on page 144. Sorry there. What Engels, the problem that people end up later having with Engels, I think including Lewis, is that Lewis, Engels in trying to kind of locate within capitalism the source of women's oppression, ends up focusing on property relations and not on labor relations. Is anyone super familiar with the kind of basic outline of Engels' stuff on feminism and origins of the family? So the basic outline there is that, and this is a this is like smash dance Engels. If you're gonna work with this more and more depth, I'm happy to give you more reading on it. I'll talk about this a little bit more in my lecture later as well. But the basic idea is that Engels is reading a lot of stagist anthropology by people like Lewis Morgan, and they're really interested in figuring out the kind of stages of development of people from X to communism, right? And the thesis is that there was a kind of form of primitive matriarchal communism in which everything was shared, in which people hunted and gathered. There was no property, and that the introduction of the herd and the introduction of farming meant that you suddenly had stuff. Once you had stuff, you had to figure out who got it after you died, and that kind of need to figure out the kind of distribution of things led to the development of patrilineal families, right, in which the father's identity is important, not the mother's identity, in terms of determining who gets the stuff, right, who gets the herd, who gets the hut, who gets the stone things. And then that's kind of where this big shift in power occurs. That's where men become much more powerful. And that's where the kind of source of all these things lie. But Engels is still mostly talking there about stuff and not about, it's about a property relationship and not about a labor relationship. And of course, property and labor are in some ways the same thing, but there is that kind of difference. Does that make sense? Cool. So what is Marx's theory of surplus value? And she defines it really well, I think, in here. It's one of these things that people have a lot of long fights about, but just for the purposes of this seminar. What does she say surplus value is? On 144. So it's on 146 actually. So Lewis writes in them on the bottom paragraph on 146. In capital, surplus value is, reductively put, the term for profit minus costs for any individual capitalist and profit after the payment of wages for the capitalist class as a whole. It is the extra value produced by a laborer beyond what is necessary to produce themselves as a laborer, as represented by their individual wage. So basically, surplus value is, yeah, it's that. It's the income of a productive unit, let's call it a factory for now, minus the costs of the workers. And this is where we start getting into this question of social reproduction, right? Because that question of the costs required to have the workers, that includes kind of how the workers themselves are made and produced. And do we get that? Like, are we clear on what we mean here by social reproduction theory? That social reproduction theory has to do with the kind of reproduction of both workers and kind of systems of social relationships. And did anyone have questions about that or how those things kind of plug in together? We are clear on that? We aren't clear on that? I'm hearing silence, which I don't quite know how to interpret. Yeah, okay. So how then do Marxist feminists begin to critique Marx and Engels themselves on these questions of, be it daily life or women's work or social reproduction more broadly? Did anyone get anything out of Lisa Vogel, what Lewis says about Vogel?
Well, she talks about how domestic labor is basically invisible and how it's crucial.
I'm sorry, could you repeat yourself briefly? I couldn't quite, you kind of went out.
Sorry. So she talks about how domestic labor is invisible and how it's crucial for the reproductions of the conditions of working day and for sustaining the whole process of production.
Sorry, Alexei, we're losing you. Can you start again?
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay, so Lisa Vogel, she talks about how domestic labor is invisible and how it's crucial for the production of the conditions of the production itself.
Mm-hmm. And what does she mean by, so this thing, Lewis points out this sort of conflict that comes up between a lot of Marxist feminists, or between a lot of feminists who aren't Marxists and a lot of Marxists, about this question of unproductive labor and the fact that this work in the home is called unproductive labor. What is unproductive labor? And why isn't it an insult?
I think unproductive labor is labor that doesn't produce direct monetary value for the capitalist or for the one that owns the means of production.
Mm-hmm.
And the productive labor would be something that does this. So the big question is, not domestic labor, but reproductive labor is considered productive or unproductive labor. And
right.
I think, yeah.
And so there's this Dalla Costa, Selma James, Sylvia Federici way of thinking, wages for housework campaign, etc., in which domestic labor is productive, right? Women are the slaves of wage slaves.
Mm-hmm.
It is sort of directly productive. Or there's this Lisa Vogel idea that it isn't directly productive. Now that's an important distinction to make if and when you want to do continued theoretical work on social reproduction theory. For the purposes of this seminar, the question of whether domestic labor is or is not directly productive is not particularly important. I'm actually not sure what Sophie and Michelle's positions on that are. I myself can be convinced both ways. It kind of depends whether it's Wednesday or Thursday. Lewis certainly thinks that it isn't. So let's follow her for a little bit. Why doesn't Lewis and Vogel think that it is? Why do Lewis and Vogel think, think that social reproductive labor is not itself productive, quote unquote? It's there on 150.
Because
okay, just someone say this. I don't really care who said this, but because it doesn't produce the direct value for the capital, and she does this nice comparison with the child doodles, and she shows that although she discusses that his labor is not productive since he is just since he doesn't produce the surplus value, and that's basically it.
Yep, and the other thing, and this is important here, is on 154, just important as we kind of introduce these concepts, because part of what I want to do is prepare us to kind of think through the things we're going to think through in the next few weeks, and part of the things I want to do is give you guys kind of a toolkit for beginning to take some of these questions out into your own work. And just this is important only on that last one. On 154, one of Vogel's big arguments here is that because wages are already determined by the cost of reproducing the existing labor force, right? Wages in this kind of Marxian view are the minimum required thing necessary to keep workers like alive and there and able to do their thing. Social reproduction is included in that already, right? And Vogel's argument is that because social reproduction is included in that already, domestic labor is included in that already, all these things are in there, so it's not productive labor. Again, that is not the most crucial question for this, but I just thought it was important to kind of think this all through.
There's there's one sentence that I think I have no comment on it, but I think it might be useful.
Good.
On the top of 153, unproductive labor is labor that does not produce a commodity that capitalists can trade.
Yes.
Which I think is quite interesting, given that it gives us an object to think with, which is named the commodity object, or the commoditous object, or whatever.
Great. So, before we close the book on Lewis, I want to ask about what she says about affective labor. This is on page 153, and affective labor is a term that gets thrown around a lot in contemporary queer and feminist conversation. Some of you may have heard it. Does anyone want to define affective labor or talk about what they kind of think it might be? Context in which they've heard the term. If you have heard it kind of being thrown around?
It's labor that is produced via the distribution of our emotions or affective engagement. So I think it kind of like this, I mean, in feminist theory or affect theory also, it's usually argued that this labor disproportionately targets, for example, women or service workers or, you know, marginalized people, etc.
Yeah, so like
they need to perform more. Yeah.
Sorry. Yes, like the classic example of affective labor, right, is that you know, you go into the chain fancy sandwich shop, right? You go into the Pret, and the person standing behind the counter is expected to smile at you, and they're expected to be nice to you, and that's like part of their job. Flight attendants, it comes up a lot with, you know, thinking about these different kind of service roles, and then the fact that these kinds of service roles are also gendered genders it. Why doesn't Lewis think that it's particularly useful?
Yeah, I kind of wanted to use not Lewis, but I think Lewis kind of, sorry, Lewis kind of goes in depth with Federici, who basically says that the she stays with the concept of reproductive labor and criticizes the concept of the affective labor, since the reproductive labor still produces the surplus value, and it's not, it can't be detached from like the other labors that are included in that, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's that. Any other kind of thinking, thoughts, questions, malfunctions, burning points?
I'm sorry,
yeah.
Sasha, could you, I'm not sure I understood exactly what that.
Yeah, I like, yeah, what didn't you understand?
I'm not sure, just the last part of sort of like multiple laborers and like
like basically what Federici writes in The Wages for Work, like in Revolution Ground Zero, she criticizes this concept of affective labor by saying that no labor is like that it can't be detached from like material, from like other definitions, like from a broader definition of labor as something material. And so she basically says that it makes no sense to define one sort of labor as just affective one. And so she prefers to use the reproductive labor as some term that puts everything together, I would say. Is it that?
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So basically, yeah. So this is a sort of more integrated way, and sort of yeah. And the basic goal here with those two texts, or with the Lewis text mostly, and we're going to turn to Griffiths now, is to think through kind of ways of thinking these things together in an integrated way. And obviously that means that you can't get everything in there, but the point is not to kind of resolve necessarily every contradiction, but just to figure out what is kind of a productive way of thinking these kind of different tendencies or these different strains together. So let's turn to the Griffiths now. Originally, the Griffiths was only on week 4. It's something that Michelle suggested, and then I ended up thinking that it got into a lot of the themes that I wanted us to be having in our heads the whole time, that I figured I'd actually have you read it for today. So I'll give you a second to get the Griffiths open, because the Griffiths moves from Lewis, which is more about integrating these different kind of ways of thinking or ways of knowing or ways of organizing in a historical or a theoretical way. And Griffiths gets us much more into very concrete questions of like, what does this actually look like on the ground? So why does Griffiths shy away from this category of queer or trans Marxism? And just to clarify for a moment, the reason why queer and trans Marxism are being used here in this kind of, they're not, queer and trans are obviously certainly not interchangeable categories. Queer and trans Marxism are sometimes interchangeable terms among a certain group of people who are kind of thinking in this Holly Lewis, Kate Doyle Griffiths circle now. So why does she shy away from that category of queer or trans Marxism? What's her kind of worry about that as a kind of way of thinking about what she's doing or what this is all doing?
I think she's worried about it sort of, I think she calls it siloing out different perspectives or arguments. And much like you were saying earlier, I think she's sort of directed more towards a kind of trying to find a universalism in the sort of overall Marxist conversation instead of having these separate streams that can end up dividing the subject.
Mm-hmm. And the question, right? And we get into this in, that was really well said, Susie. The question, and we get into this at the end of, we got into this kind of at the end of the Lewis text when you read it, and here and now, right, is hard. And it's, in some ways, I think it's kind of the fundamental question for any kind of collective organizing project, or certainly one of them, which is how do you do the really important and necessary work of materially important work, and work that's related to like ground level questions of solidarity, of hearing and acknowledging and addressing and understanding all of these different specific experiences, right? And that's what Lewis talks about a little bit when she's talking about the material politics of language, that concept. Without spiraling out into all of these different things. So how, in other words, how do you use that at the beginning? How do you use the specific as a way into the universal without doing this thing? I love the way that, so she's talking about the critics as someone else, but I love the way that she puts this, this kind of Marxist against identity politics, kind of caricature of left politics thing, right? Where she calls critics on the right end of the spectrum who have called for an anti-particularist social democratic program advanced with a strategy that can't do both class politics and any specifically anti-racist, feminist, or pro-trans activity or whatever. And that's, you know, all we need is Medicare for all, right? And then everything else is somehow just going to kind of resolve itself underneath that or whatever. That's a caricature of what that argument is, but there it is. I don't think it's an argument that deserves much more than a caricature. And then, but then the thing that you want to stay away from, right, is this world of completely atomized individual identities where there's no possibility for understanding anyone else's way of thinking, a way of knowing. And in fact, in the most radical interpretations of this, you see people actually saying that solidarity and empathy are forms of violence. Not that solidarity and empathy poorly applied can hurt others, but that solidarity and empathy, like the attempt to have solidarity or empathy, is itself a form of violence. Again, that's a like caricatured extreme version of that argument, but I'm just trying to sort of lay out what the kind of rocks are that we're trying to steer the boat between. Going back to Griffiths, she has this concept of the queer frame. Or a sort of queer framing, queer Marxist feminist framing. What are the two things that she says the queer frame kind of helps us avoid or kind of helps us navigate through? One of them we just talked about. So I'll just jump in here. It's on the first page. It says a queer Marxist feminist frame not only calls into question the divide between identity and class, but also undermines a historical opposition between organizing inside and other strategies for worker and socialist organizing outside the workplace. And so we were thinking about this in the workplace, outside the workplace thing earlier, and now we can think more about it because it showed up. My train of thought just derailed. Yes, okay, so this is sort of what we were talking about. We were talking about productive and unproductive labor, or those questions that we were talking about earlier. So there's this divides, maybe not in Marxist projects, but in a lot of left projects, about whether the best place or sort of the proper site of organizing is in the workplace or not in the workplace. Or maybe if we take Dalla Costa and Federici at their word, the home for women and maybe for queer people is the workplace, it becomes the workplace. And so that's kind of where she thinks, by sort of thinking through some of these things in a queer way, she thinks that we can kind of get around some of these roadblocks. Where does she place queer workers within this strategy? And this is more on page 3. What queer and trans workers have the potential to do. Did anybody get this? So what I'm talking about here is that middle paragraph on page 3, where she says, queer and trans workers have the potential to intensify this connection between workplace organizing and class consciousness, and between shop floor struggles, social movements, and class demands. Queers can demonstrate the role that affinity groups can play in a broader left strategy. An actual existing social force, a basis of militant minority organizing across and between workplace and community, produced by and arrayed against sexual violence, reproductive authoritarianism, and the coercions of the family as forces that limit and damage working class people and which present barriers to the actualization of class politics. And the example that she gives, which I think is really smart and good, is healthcare. Because healthcare, on the one hand, is the kind of, has become, at least in the past couple of years, the kind of marquee, and at least on the kind of US American left, and I think in many other places as well, some demands for a universal socialized medical system have become really central to left conversations and left demands and this kind of rebirth of the left, quote unquote, that's going on. And on the one hand, this is obviously crucial and important thing, would be a crucial kind of non-reformist reform in that kind of Gortzian or Luxemburgian sense, right, where a reform like that gives people more time and space to organize, and also the kind of experience of having won something and kind of fuel to continue to fight. On the other hand, if you start denying the particularity of certain lived experiences to try to fight for universal healthcare, you lose, from the queer side, for example, a whole history of queer organizing around healthcare, especially as related to, in terms of gay men, mostly but not exclusively gay men, the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s and 1990s, which is also ongoing in a lot of racialized and minoritized communities and working class communities around the world, or trans demands for access to healthcare, or intersex demands, both for access to healthcare and for protection from healthcare systems, which, for example, for intersex people are people who are born with people who doctors have a hard time assigning either male or female at birth. Oftentimes those people have, as infants, very invasive cosmetic surgery to make them look more, quote unquote, normally male or female. And so the kind of histories of organizing that queer folks have had around the medical system can actually inform that broader universal debate, right? Rather than distracting from it, rather than just being, oh, that's just something you want to talk about and we want to fight for the real thing. Like, that is the real thing, right? The real thing is understanding how these systems actually work in people's lives, and how understanding how they work in people's lives makes fighting for them easier and better and more productive overall. Does that make sense as a concept?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I had a question / concern about both of the texts we read today, because is it me, or am I completely misreading this? But I had a weird feeling that both of these texts kind of overlook the agency of the state, and just speak about, like, they solely speak about capitalism, and they don't really discuss the politics of the state. And this makes this whole approach, I would say, pretty Eurocentric, because like, for instance, for gay people in or like LGBT people or queer people, whatever, in Eastern Europe, it is like a completely different situation, and there is this really big agency of the state being present. For instance, if a transgender person wants to transition, they need to encounter a lot more complications. So I kind of felt really weird about this, reading this text, but maybe I'm kind of misreading or like missing something out.
Did anyone share those concerns? I want to hear from other people before I kind of respond, if anyone has things to say on that.
Yeah, I also felt it was pretty culturally specific. But I think, at least in the Lewis text, she kind of does state that at some point, that I'm speaking particularly from this context. So I took it as such. But yeah, it's definitely, both texts feel very context specific in that way.
They certainly are. And I'm, yes, they are culturally specific texts. And yeah, that is true. In 4 sessions, it's not possible to do a fully comprehensive sort of case study of all of this. In terms of thinking about the state, and especially in regards to Eastern Europe, Sasha, just neither of these things were in the text, but maybe this will help, or in the text, but maybe this will help reassure you that at least these are problems that this kind of thinking is interested in, even if it didn't get there in what we read today. One of the, so there was just a meeting of this Sexuality and Political Economy Network a week ago. And one of the folks who was presenting, a sociologist named Colin Wilson, was presenting on the question of the relationship between the state, the kind of NGO universe, which those often have very different sources of funding in the Eastern European context, right? Where the NGOs,
Yes.
Yeah, so the NGOs are often funded by money from Western Europe,
there is this whole issue of colonization.
Yeah. And then how kind of queer people are increasingly in the Eastern European context forced to navigate this really kind of awful situation where, on the one hand, there's the state which finds perhaps some kind of political value or power or what have you in increasingly often violent attacks on queer people in queer life, the LGBT free zones in Poland, many other things to name. And then on the other hand, affiliation with Western-funded NGOs, which offer only a certain kind of liberation based around a certain kind of funding model. And actually then the source of the money for those NGOs often drives opposition to queer people and queer movements, because it becomes very easy for the state, if it's Poland or if it's Hungary, to say, gay is this thing that was invented by those people, by George Soros, by the NGOs, by the EU. You don't like George Soros, you don't like the EU, therefore you don't like gay people. So there is thinking going on about that to some extent, and you're right in that there's not so much concrete thinking about the state in these two texts. My two sessions are not going to think about the state too much. I think Michelle and Sophie will a bit more.
I think could I ask you to share this text in like the sociologist you described in the classroom, because it is interesting also from the point of view that in Russia in the 90s the female organizations basically were funded by American and like the NGOs of the global north, let's put it this way. And so for that reason, like this feminist agenda of that time was largely formed by that, and it's an interesting and important issue. So I would kind of ask you to share this text, if there is a text about this in the classroom, please.
Also, if you could email me and remind me of both of those points, because I also remember, and I can find it if I look.
Okay.
Specifically about the Russian women's organization, and that for you. The only thing I'll say is I have to ask that sociologist whether he's okay with that.
Yeah. Okay, fine.
So, what I want to do now is take 5 minutes where we can all like pee, get a drink of water, whatever. I just need some more water, and then I'm going to talk for a bit about my own work and kind of one concrete case of one queer Marxist activist in the 20th century trying to think of a revolutionary social role for queer people using some of the ideas that we discussed. So let's take like 5 minutes, even less. I just need to refill my glass of water, and then once I see you're all back, we'll start. Cool. So I think folks are back. Let me give it a couple more minutes. I'm just trying to make sure I have everyone before we start again. Cool. So, I'm going to mute you all. And I'm going to talk for a bit, and we can sort of collect questions for the end of the session. And I'm going to stop talking so there's enough time for some questions. Then we can divide up the texts for the presentations. And then if there's more questions, you can email me, or we can hang out for 5 minutes after that. I just want to make sure that we divide the presentations up by 9:30 or by 30 past the hour, 1 hour from now when this thing officially ends, so that any of you who need to go at that point can. So this first talk that I'm giving is based off of one of my oldest kind of ongoing pieces of academic research, which is about US American gay communist activist named Harry Hay. And pretty much all serious considerations of the history of American LGBT movements, especially when those histories do the thing that still too few of them do and realize that there was life before Stonewall, we'll get around to mentioning Hay. And he was an activist, a troublemaker, a theorist, a founder of this organization called the Mattachine Society, which was founded in Los Angeles by Hay and 7 other communists in 1948. And became the first kind of lasting gay or queer liberation organizing group of any kind in the United States. And the way that, I'm not going to say that, and so the way that Hay is often kind of thought about, and after Mattachine, he, well, I should actually do this now. So he spends his early life as an activist first in the Industrial Workers of the World, and then as a kind of agitprop theater artist in the Communist Party. He then founds the Mattachine Society. Then under the pressures of McCarthyism, this sort of period of intense persecution of both communists and homosexuals in the US in the early 1950s, he finds himself excluded by the communists because he's gay, and excluded by the gays because he's a communist. And so he sort of spends 15, 20 years in the desert and then comes rolling back into public life in the 1970s, founding this kind of gay, esoteric, Marxist, back to the land hippie group called the Radical Fairies. And the way that Hay and sort of his work on theories and various things tend to be thought about is by most scholars who do consider Hay, when they do consider Hay, is that he's seen as an essentialist, somebody who viewed same-sex loving people not as socially constructed subjects whose identities have shifted over time along with modes of production and exchange, in that kind of Drucker way that we were talking about earlier, but rather as subjects whose identities are inborn and who have these innate kind of ahistorical, even spiritual, mystical qualities. And some recent scholarship, including the article by Bettina Apteker that I sent you all, just because I wanted you to have some idea of who this person was before I started talking, and I think she's got one of the best things that's out there that I didn't write on it. Some of that scholarship has begun to examine his ideas more intensively. A lot of dominant accounts, I think, of the history of queer liberation and queer movement politics don't really think enough about Hay's ideas or their influence. And I think that's partially in the US context because a lot of people don't want to admit that such an influential kind of theorist of gay life, in fact, one of the people who can be said to have kind of co-constituted or co-invented gay identities as they exist in the United States, and therefore because of this kind of dominant position of the United States in the world, was a communist. So Hay, the other way that a lot of people think about Hay and his work when they're not thinking about him just as an essentialist is a kind of post-colonial reading or critique that's offered by folks like Scott Loria Morgenson. And Morgenson's book, which was published in 2011, is called Spaces Between Us. And it is a very penetrating and not really refutable critique of Hay's work from a post-colonial perspective, which critiques the way that Hay interacted with, both in his life and in his thinking, indigeneity as a concept, and also native peoples and groups. I will address Morgenson later. I will talk about Morgenson later. I don't disagree with Morgenson. My response to Morgenson is yes, and. What I want to do is read Hay and his critics contrarially rather than in contradiction. I don't want to return to an uncritical view of Hay or of the project of gay liberation, or to be, in the words of Jill Lepore, a historian who loves too much, unable to separate myself from my subject or analyze the subject's sort of limitations or failings. But I do think that a possibility exists for an enriching, productive, and potentially even politically useful or important reparative reading of Hay's theory, its connections to other sets of political and social ideas, both same-sex loving related and not, and its possibilities for the present. And I take inspiration for this method from the American historian of transgender identities, Susan Stryker, who herself calls upon Eve Sedgwick's vision of the reparative reading, which then itself originates in the psychoanalytic work of Melanie Klein. So now quoting Sedgwick, the reparative, Sedgwick says, is, quote, the possibility, the position, from which it is possible to use one's own resources to assemble or repair murderous part objects. And what the part objects comes from Kleinian infant psychology, that the infant has to assemble the visual inputs of, for example, the mother's jutting breast, and then realize that nourishment is there and it's good. And the infant has to kind of put that together. Obviously, especially as we think about critiques of social reproduction, the use of that example by Klein is sort of rich for critique, but that's the example Klein used. That's kind of the paradigmatic Kleinian example, So assuming that identities are contingent and expressive of broader trends in production or exchange, Stryker has this great quote where she talks about identities being where the rubber of material politics or structural politics hits the road of lived experience, right? That expression where the rubber hits the road, like where the tire hits the road, like where the contact is made. Sometimes marks are left. There's really something warm and interesting and productive and energy creating happening there. So if you assume that that's how identities work, which is kind of what we were talking about with Lewis and Griffiths earlier, if you read history reparatively, you can discover what Stryker calls a viewpoint outside or above familiar historical narratives. And ultimately, Stryker suggests, quote, our shared histories actually contain the tools we need to wage our freedom struggles if we can reassemble the frightening partial objects of our worst imaginings, transforming them into something we can be nourished by. In Stryker's formulation, this remembering otherwise, or remembering reparatively, is a tool for marginalized communities to find representation for themselves in unfriendly pasts. And in this lecture, I'm using it in that way, but also as a way for marginalized communities, in this case, queer people, that have themselves marginalized and oppressed other kinds of subaltern communities, to recover useful tools for collectively building futures without and against all of these oppressions. We might see in Hay's notes and articles and theories part objects, some of which inspire and thrum with possibility, and some of which intimidate and harm with colonial assumptions and essentialist rumblings, and many of which do both in one sentence. And so in this lecture, using the kind of techniques of intellectual biography, and using Hay's work as a kind of case study for one really, I think, pretty historically influential way of thinking queerness and labor, or queerness and Marxist politics together, I want to offer some conclusions about what kind of nourishing whole we might make from Hay's words, and then gesture at some connections and comparisons in related areas of social movement theory and history. So that's kind of what we're going to do. So the period between the early 1950s founding of the homophile movements and the 1969 Stonewall Rebellion is sort of where most of what I'm going to talk about today is dated from. The 1969 Stonewall Rebellion in the US is often credited, it's kind of the mainstream historiography of queer liberation movements to credit that movement with the sort of kickoff or the beginning of an era that's often termed gay liberation or gay and lesbian liberation. I don't think it needs to be said, but I will say it again because in case it needs to be said, it's good to say. The Stonewall Rebellion was not the beginning of queer experience. It was not the beginning of queer movement organizing. Even if we're only limiting ourselves to the US American context, even if we're only limiting ourselves to the Western context, there's the Conference Cafeteria Rebellion in 1966. There's all kinds of thinking going on. And the most useful way to think about Stonewall is this moment when, as happens in different kinds of revolutions, whether complete or abortive, all of these different things that have already been going on suddenly kind of catalyze. And for some potentially mysterious reason, I'm not a historian of Stonewall, so I'm not an expert on what that reason is, but people have offered different theories. But for some reason, this kind of fire breaks out and this kind of moment happens. So that's kind of where we're focusing on. And all of this thinking that's going on, this identity formation, this process of identity formation that's occurring in the 1950s and 1960s is part of that Drucker thing I talked about earlier, right? Where the invert dominant sexual regime of the penetrated homosexualized partner and the other people with whom that person is having sex aren't homosexualized, aren't considered queer, aren't considered gay, aren't considered whatever. That's another thing. I'm playing fast and loose with terms in this lecture. Feel free to yell at me about it. I'm using queer pretty much right now, ahistorically and as a very useful catch term because I don't want to say same-sex loving and gender nonconforming every 30 seconds. I will also use a bunch of different words to talk about same-sex loving and gender nonconforming people throughout this lecture, and I will do that in concert with what the people I'm talking about were doing at that time. I will now go back to the identity formation. So this process of identity formation is going on. Hay is an important part of this process of identity formation, and his encounters with Native communities, his readings of Boasian and other kinds of relativist anthropology, and an ongoing study of Marxist writing about the family and the state led him to develop a unique, powerful, and extraordinarily limited analysis of same-sex love as a form of social labor. And his work, I think, deserves to be considered alongside in other conversations with and can inform conversations about social reproductive labor and Marxist feminism and queer Marxism and the Marxist intellectual tradition. So Harry Hay was born in 1912, which is the week, he was born the week the Titanic went down, actually, to an American family in London. And he first became radicalized and also first encountered indigenous peoples and cultures by working as a field hand on farms in California and Nevada. In the introduction to his collection of published essays, Radically Gay, Hay describes a childhood memory of an encounter with Wovoka, or Jack Wilson was his white name, who was the founder of the Ghost Dance religion, which was a native religious and political movement of revolutionary resistance against kind of aggressive phase of dispossession occurring at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. Later in his life in the 1970s, Hay would become politically involved in campaigns for land protection and water rights with Native communities in New Mexico, where he then lived. And he went off to graduate from Los Angeles High School, went off to Stanford, and proudly at Stanford in the 1930s identified on the Stanford campus as a, quote, temperamental, which was the contemporary slang for homosexual. he dropped out of Stanford and moved to Los Angeles. And it was there in Los Angeles that he moved back to Los Angeles, rather. And it was there in Los Angeles that he encountered the Communist Party and was first brought in by the American Communist Party's appeals to artists during the Popular Front period of the 1930s. He, at this point, was friends with many countercultural luminaries. He spent the summer of 1929 living with John Cage and his then boyfriend in a house with no furniture in the Pacific Palisades, reading all of Proust's In Search of Lost Time out loud. He ended up being the world premiere performer of some of John Cage's first compositions and acted in agitprop theater troupes influenced by Brechtian techniques. His associates in those groups included the well-known American political playwright Clifford Odets, who, as part of the Works Progress Administration federal artist grants in the 1930s, would end up writing some very kind of well-known plays and pieces. And for a while, he continued his gay and political lives together. He had affairs with a wide variety of Los Angeles figures, including the German refugee actor and writer Hans Heinrich von Twardowski, who he recalled telling him about Berlin's theater and political scene of the 1920s. Twardowski, before fleeing Berlin with Marlene Dietrich in the early 1930s, had been good friends with the Marxist cabaret artist and political satirist Kurt Tucholsky, had been in the world premieres of left expressionist plays by Bertolt Brecht in Brecht's expressionist phase, and Arnold Brunnen, and Twardowski, who had the affair with, had also had his draft exemption for World War I been written by Magnus Hirschfeld. Magnus Hirschfeld, of course, being the Jewish socialist sexologist who founded the Institute for Sexual Sciences in Berlin after the Social Democratic Revolution of 1919, and spent a brief period of the Weimar Republic advocating for legal reforms around sex and gender of many different kinds. His relationship with Twardowski contributed three major things, I think, to his thinking. First, a knowledge of those pre-war German movements. He was able, before those pre-war German movements for homosexual emancipation were really known about in the US, Hay was able to give a very kind of concrete analysis of where he thought they had gone wrong and why and how he thought they had failed. Second, the influence and kind of expressive vocabulary of theater as a form of political organizing. And third, a language for a kind of labor that occurs outside of the factory. And the first exposure Hay would have had to that kind of language would have been in language about spiritual labor and the German geistige Arbeit that he would have heard about from or discussed in conversations with Twardowski. For those who aren't familiar, the term geistige Arbeit comes out of artists' councils, which formed after the 1919 revolution, which were trying to think about sort of what the role of artists would be in the ongoing revolution and in the new state. And these tended not to last very long, these artists' councils, but they started to talk about what they were doing as geistige Arbeit, or spiritual labor, and that they were contributing this kind of labor, and that was where they kind of found that was where they sort of fit into this labor piece. For more on spiritual labor in context, the best book, I think, is by Robert Hainan. It's called Degeneration and Revolution, Radical Cultural Politics in the Body in Weimar, Germany, Haymarket Books, 2016. So that's kind of, these kind of the influences on Hay coming in through Twardowski. And at this time, Hay is involved in all these political things, but is also known, he would later recall, as, quote, the best amateur cocksucker on Hollywood Boulevard. The best professional, of course, was the future Mrs. Nancy Reagan. At some point in the 1940s, Hay is convinced, as he begins to become a popular educator in the Communist Party, and begins to move from doing these kind of agitprop theater performances to teaching classes on the materialist history of music at the California Labor School of the American Communist Party. Sort of 10-century-long materialist history of music. As that becomes more popular, as it becomes more useful to the party is at this time beginning to follow the kind of Stalinist turn, sort of Stalinist homophobic, or sort of move back towards the family or the traditional family that's happening. And so Hay goes to a psychotherapist and decides that he doesn't actually want to be with a man, he wants to be with a mannish woman, and so he marries Anita Platke, a woman, and they adopt 2 daughters during the war years. This goes south relatively quickly, and by 1948, when his daughters are about 8 and 6 years old, he begins to privately sort of return to homosexuality. And in 1948, he kind of dreams up the idea for organizing gay people along the lines of the kind of secretive structure of communist cells at that time, where there were sort of ways of organizing where you could conceal who other people were. Of course, at this time in the US-American context, sodomy is extraordinarily illegal. It's illegal to serve a gay person a drink. People are being committed. People like Henry Cowell, who was also sort of part of this circle of people that Hay would have known in the 30s, was committed to a mental institution and given sort of state-focused, state-mandated shock therapy. Just to get into those questions of the state that Sasha were talking about earlier, so that's kind of what's going on. In 1950, in July of 1950, Hay meets Rudy Gernreich at his daughter's dance class. He's one of his daughter's dance teachers, and Rudy Gernreich is a fashion designer and dancer who fled Red Vienna with his socialist family and settled in Southern California. And he entered into a 3-year-long relationship with Hay. Gernreich would go on to become a very kind of influential fashion designer, kind of bringing the kind of German Lebensreform, free body stuff of the 1920s into the 1960s and sort of co-constituting modern hip fashion. He invented the women's topless swimsuit, a lot of kind of space-agey stuff. You can kind of look up his work and see pictures of it. And Hay recruits 7 other gay men from his communist music history classes, and they begin to meet and discuss questions like, what are we, and what does that mean, and what should we do about that? And there are kind of these very basic questions that begin. And then things kind of, by the spring of 1953, it looks like they have every reason to celebrate, because in 1952, they had successfully defended one of their members in court against charges of lewd conduct. And it's one of the first successful defenses against lewd conduct at that time. One of their original 7 members got picked up in a truck stop restroom by someone who turned out to be a cop, and they managed to get him off. And by getting him off, they generated tremendous interest in their organization, which began to grow rapidly. And the way that it works is that you have a discussion group of 7 people, 7 to 10 people. Each one of those people would then lead their own discussion group, but no one at any level would know who everyone was. And so that way, if something was raided or if someone ratted everyone out, there was no complete organizational file, and you could never get anybody, and that gave people a little bit more security in terms of being in the group. And so new discussions began popping up all over Southern California. They were getting letters from as far away as Australia. But along with these thousands of members, and there were about 2,000 members in this organization at that time, which is pretty huge given the sort of climate and the time, came not a lot, but a certain degree of media attention and a certain degree of fear among members, some of which is probably grounded, that the fact that they're in this organization led by communists, potentially led by communists, this is a rumor that it's all kind of a communist front cell. At one point, they're described in the Los Angeles tabloid as the Comintern, is going to put everyone at risk. And so by 1955, the members have kind of revolted. They all managed to call this kind of convention. At that convention, the original 7 founders kind of revealed themselves in this dramatic fashion for the first time and then step back. And the organization becomes much more assimilationist. The organization embraces anti-communism. Hay ends up himself being called before the House Committee on American Activities. When he's called in front of the House Committee, he is excluded from all the gay legal defenses because he was a communist. He's excluded from all the communist legal defenses because he was gay. And so he's kind of hung out to dry. Rudy leaves to go to New York because he wants to have a fashion career, and all this communism is a little bit dangerous, and maybe he doesn't want to be associated with all that stuff. And so that's kind of where all this ends up by the mid 1950s. And so this is where Hay begins to turn to this very intensive period of research, right? So organizing has failed, at least right now. So I want to try to still answer some of these questions on my own, he thinks. And so his extensive research notes, which I've gone through, I don't want to brag, but probably more than anyone else in the world, are structured by subject and not by date. He would research a variety of topics simultaneously, writing or typing on half-sheet onion skins, and then he would sort of type up his little essays as he moved through it. His life was haunted by problematic symbolic associations between white homophile activism, or white gay activism, and indigenous theory, activism, politics, and ways of knowing. And the theory that he developed of gay people as a cultural minority included, had as a central element, a reading of a particular third gender or non-binary Native American sexual institution that he referred to as berdache. And that term, which is currently not preferred, currently kind of berdache theory has been revised by Native queer critique into ideas about two-spirit. That's kind of a term that a lot of Native queer people began to kind of organize around. Comes from, or referred to rather, a white anthropological concept of a universal queer formation in indigenous American cultures. So when I talk about berdache, I am not talking about something real. I am talking about something that was in the anthropology that he would have been reading and that was then part of his theoretical toolkit. And Hay arrived at the term in Ruth Benedict, the sort of lefty, culturally relativist anthropologist's book, Patterns of Culture. And then he extended his reading into the works of Robert Graves, Margaret Mead, and Franz Boas. And Patterns of Culture presents cultures in comparative analysis, and kind of relativist anthropology in general is thinking more about understanding cultures on their own terms rather than trying to apply them to arbitrary standards of development. And so this relativism, with its many problems, right? I'm not presenting this relativism as a panacea or as correct or as anti-racist, just as a way of thinking. Profoundly influenced Hay's method and his resulting materialist and proto-constructionist view of how dominant modes of production via social and cultural codes shape sexual impulses into identities. And this close connection between gay identity formation and this kind of anthropology has gone, I think, relatively underemphasized in the scholarly literature, and I'm going to skip over some of this because I'm running a little bit long here. So if the Boasians provided one pole, the classical Marxism Hay had learned in the 1920s and 30s and 40s as a student and then an instructor at the California Labor School provided the other pole. So in all of Hay's discussions of Native societies or of sort of gay roles in non-state societies, he continually restated the principles of a text that was very familiar to him, which is Engels' Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State. And as we discussed earlier in that book, Engels deconstructs the bourgeois nuclear family's claim to natural status with a vision of this primitive matrilineal communism, with this kind of transition from matriarchy to patriarchy, which also involves sort of spiritual shifts from goddess figures to god figures, comes with the introduction of individual ownership with herds, with farming, and so it has to do with property relations. So it was in his work for the music class, so jumping back a little bit to that music class at the California Labor School, that Hay began to adopt these sort of Engelsian concept vocabularies, and to lay out a materialist analysis of cultural practices. So he would look at elements of a popular folk tune, for example, the tune that became Green Leaves. He would then listen to many, many different field recordings and look back through many different sources and kind of find snippets of the same tune, and then start to search for connections, right, between musical styles, between cultural practices, and then between those styles and practices and regimes of production and exchange. And he then starts to do the same thing in the 1950s with evidence of these Berdache figures. And so if Engels' argument, right, is that primitive communism represented human society's past and future, and that matriarchy was central to that system, Hay's contribution is to add to that rubric a proto-queer figure that he, relying on relativist anthropology, called Berdache, as a key figure in the practice, maintenance, and renewal of that once and future communism, and to argue that living queers should help bring about that once and future communism by doing the social labor that was associated with the Berdache in the anthropology that he was reading. And so the Engelsian claim that emancipating women is impossible so long as women are shut out from socially productive labor and restricted to private domestic labor, that maps neatly onto Hay's insistence on finding liberation for same-sex loving people through what he would always call socially productive contributions. And so Hay is always talking about needing to find that gay liberation will only come when we find a kind of socially productive role for ourselves. So maybe disagreeing with the idea that this kind of work, that kind of social reproductive labor is productive in and of itself. But Hay maybe thinks that we need to sort of find a way for it to be, or find a way to make ourselves do that kind of work. And again, this is taking neither a historically specific angle that argues that it's impossible to make any comparisons between different kinds of same-sex romantic social institutions, but it's also not a universalist approach that argues that homosexuality has always existed in roughly the same forms. Instead, the argument is that changing cultures have created a variety of historically specific institutional forms for same-sex love and contact. And then his argument is that one of them, because of the kind of social labor that it does, is better, and that's the one that we should all be doing. So how does Hay think that these same-sex loving institutions evolve? He thinks that they evolved out of patterns of behavior that were rooted in sort of fundamental muscular or neurological patterns. The then common understanding of homosexuality as deviancy, he thought, spawned from a psychiatric hoo-ha and didn't conform to historical evidence. He thought that you could read a history of these impulses towards same-sex love back into scholarship, and through that, get someplace more. And one of his many sets of notes on this topic, Hay wrote, and I quote, "The West is in an anarcho-capitalistic social and ethical stagnation. Homophiles, as the descendants of the Berdache, have the responsibility of finding the way out." Quote, "Precisely because the Berdache, who under the most rigorous of social restrictions discovered lore as a supreme message of abstractive objective maturity, so now they have the exemplary opportunity of re-establishing that abstract as a demonstrable historical guide to ever greater concrete objectives," end quote. That's how Hay wrote. And I think the fact that he wrote that way is one of the reasons why people don't think about him more, because trying to figure out what he says is 2/3 of the game. But basically what's in there is that lore, ritual, and myth could inspire contemporary action. Berdache had been part of this once communism and now could be part of this future communism. So now I want to jump into the kind of specifics of this, thinking, especially as it applied to this question of the relationship. So if you have this idea, right, from this reading of these, this native institution, this limited and incorrect and orientalist reading of this native institution, right, that there was once this kind of universal primitive labor form of homosexuality where the Berdache were these people and did all these things, and now it could be back there again. What was that, right? What was that doing? What was that work? And how did that work relate to the question of being gay in the world? So he worked those ideas out for the first time in an exchange of letters with a friend named Jim Kepner, who ended up becoming his lover, and this is in the early 1960s. And so Marx and sort of this reading had led him to devise a historical role which he thought should be embodied in the present. And so now he's trying to think about what this actually looks like in the level of the relationship. So I'm repeating myself a little bit there because I'm seeing the time ticking and I'm trying to cut paragraphs as I talk. So in one of his first letters to Kepner, he is kind of meditating on this question of what the sort of homosexual relationship form should be. What does, and so he starts by thinking about what kind of standard heterosexual marriage is or does. So he says, the fact remains, I'm quoting the letter now, that in the hetero-marriage relationship, sexual procreation was, is, and will remain the primary function. So here Hay is classifying as primary the most kind of socially productive function of the relationship, and as secondary any aspects of the relationship that support that primary function. And so Hay's saying that in kind of Western heterosexual Christian monogamy, which is what he means by heterosexuality here, social compatibility between the two people in a couple represented, and I quote, an a priori consideration in determining assurances of marital permanence necessary to the equally compatible fulfillment of the primary functional responsibility of the pattern, like Gebalt. What he means there is that for heterosexual couples in doing traditional heterosexuality, the primary function is sexual reproduction, and that's to ensure the continuation of the species. That's what that institution is for, in his view. And against this design, he wrote, and I quote here, the minority or homo pattern is to be seen as the inverse or perhaps the converse of the predominant model. The homophile compulsion to mate was socially devoted to the requirement to conceive, deliver, and responsively rear children of the brain, in converse to the heterophilic responsibility for reproductive offspring of the body. In effect, the homophile maximum productive capacity must be seen as reproductive of the internal life of the society, in converse to the heterophile capacity to reproduce the components of the external life of the society. So let me break that down, because we're talking about brain babies and it sounds really weird. What he means here is, so when he looks at these relativist anthropological sources where he's getting this idea of the Berdache from, what he's seeing in a lot of these sources is that this is in contrast to the way that the society in which Hay lives is treating same-sex loving people, that they're kind of outcasts, that they're told that they're degenerates, whatever, that these are people who are actually, at least as seen in the studies that he's referring to, have a kind of high or important social role. And they're doing a lot of what Marxist feminists end up calling social reproductive labor. They're doing a lot of education work. They're doing a lot of care work. And so Hay, and they're doing a lot of kind of spiritual leadership as Hay understands it. And so in that, Hay sees a model of relationship for the contemporary homosexual to use their relationship to do something reproductive, to do something productive, just as Hay thought Berdache had. Straight people married based on sexual attraction to raise children. Hay thought that gay people could mate based on spiritual and intellectual attraction to create and raise revolutionary ideas, to produce the sort of reproduce the internal life of the society, what Hay calls children of the brain, in that kind of awkward phrase. He then talks about gay sex as being a form of labor, which involves the, quote, sharing and resolution of each other's fantasy, quote, developing out of a companionate mutuality of sharing each other's joy and delight as it pertains in particular to our values of beholding or participation. And so this is one of the earliest examples, I think, of finding somebody really arguing that there's the specific way of knowing, there's the specific way of seeing, but it's our responsibility to use it to deliver something bigger or to get through to something bigger. And in the remainder of that letter, that last letter to Kepner that I was just quoting from, he speculated on what it was about the Berdache that had made them special. Like, why had they done these things? How had they come to do this kind of labor? And he ends up arguing that it's because there were fewer of them and they had to learn how to find one another. That it's not obvious if you're a queer, in the way that it's sort of often not obvious if you're a queer person being raised now, what you are, why you are different from others, and what other people are thinking of you, and is anyone else thinking the same way that I'm thinking, or whatever. And so his theory was that by having to seek one another out, these sort of primitive or early kind of homosexual figures had arrived at an intellectual breakthrough, which was needing to, or learning how to consider one another's mutual subjectivity and realize how all relationships have this kind of performative aspect. And so that meant, Hay thought, that they, and by extension contemporary homosexuals, had this ability or this possibility, not a possibility that was necessarily inborn, but a possibility that could be kind of organized towards or struggled towards, of considering one another and the world with radical subjectivity, establishing relationships with one another and with other kinds of beings on more interactive levels. And Hay ended up referring to this as the subject-subject or intersubjective relationship. It's somewhat similar to what Buber is talking about with I, thou, and it ends up representing the culmination of his thinking about labor history and performance and the kind of queer relationship as itself a form of performed social reproductive labor. And so to recap this theory, this kind of dizzying array of theory here, Hay's research project was this kind of fundamentally Marxist endeavor. He was aiming to create a materialist history of the various expressions of the social and sexual urges that had historically created queer sexual identities, and from that history to define a social role for contemporary queers to inhabit. And I think that integrating Hay into this kind of history of gay Marxism provides key context for his ideas and grounds them and him in a tradition of thought that continues until today. And if we think about some of the work that's going on now in queer Marxism, whether it be Christopher Chitty's work on bans on sodomy as essential parts of the kind of transition, or Silvia Federici talking about the expropriation of women as being part of that transition to capitalism, we see how Hay's thinking fits into a kind of conversation with those things, and maybe there are things in it that reach out of, above, and around Hay's blind spots. The unification of identity with labor in Hay's analysis, I think, presents a really exciting opportunity for a reparative reading of splits and conflicts in the history of social movements across Western societies more broadly. Yeah, so that's kind of the tradition that I want to think Hay a little bit in, that I've tried to think Hay a little bit in for you all. And now I want to open the floor for about 10 minutes of questions. Then I will deal with the readings, and then I'm happy to stay on a little bit longer with anyone who wants to stay on a little bit longer, because I went a little longer than I wanted to initially go. So thank you for listening to me talk, and I'm happy now to take questions. Maybe I'll start by asking if there are any clarification questions. I think that's more important than anything else to start with, and then we can move on from there. You are all now muted at your own choice, so pipe up, raise your hand, wave. Immediate kind of clarification questions that come up. Let silence sit.
So I wanted to know if, in a way, one of his main claims or ideas was that because of this fact that queers have historically been very helpful in reproductive labor, would that somehow justify for him certain certain political concerns of his era? As in, would this mean that queers would somehow be justified, or would be obliged almost to politically form into something that could mobilize some sort of a social movement? Does that? I don't know.
It does, yeah. No, it absolutely makes sense. So basically, one of the things that Hay's reacting against is this thing that happens a lot and still does in a lot of kind of queer movement organizing, is this often this move that gets made towards a list of famous names. Like, oh yeah, you don't like gay people? Well, Michelangelo was gay, and Shakespeare was gay, and blah, 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 blah. And Hayes' point is that just listing a bunch of like ruling class fucks is not actually going to create a mass movement that's going to liberate both homophiles and anyone else, right? That what you have to do in order to do the real big important and to move through queer specificity into the kind of communist universal is to identify a labor role and like a thing that we did. And that's the tie, right? That's the sort of connecting piece rather than just this kind of list of famous people. So yeah, it's about kind of not just saying, hey, yes, hello, we would like recognition, but saying, hello, we would like recognition and we're gonna do this for the revolution, right? We're gonna contribute this to the revolution. And you could critique, many people have critiqued, very different from the way that a lot of identity politics are advanced today, is that Hayes' epistemology does not assume that the recognition of identity is a good. I mean, the assumption is that you have to figure out a reason why this is, you have to like justify why what you're doing is good and important, and not just assume that it's like, not just assume that every claim to recognition deserves recognition. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. So
I mean, I certainly, in the context, in the thinking that I come out of, I'm much less likely to, I'm very unlikely actually, to say to somebody or to say to a group or to respond to a kind of call for recognition with a, but what are you going to do for me? You know, like that doesn't particularly make sense to me, but it is kind of the tradition that he's coming out of.
yeah, so identity is only formed not on the basis of some sort of a predisposed, I don't want to say essentialism, but like kind of like not something that you're born with, or like even if you form it, it still has to be proven in a way that it's doing something productive or socially progressive. Yeah.
It's still producing something, and
yeah.
The weird thing is that sometimes they will write or talk about magic, spiritual, especially later in his life, especially after the period I was talking about, magic spiritual qualities in gay people that make them magically able to be the perfect revolutionary subjects. Then later in the same essay, he'll say, but obviously that's something that has to be sort of struggled toward or fought toward because there are obviously all of these people around me who are gay but don't have this, you know, aren't doing this thing. And so that's why my reading of him is that even when he looks like he's being an essentialist, he's not being an essentialist, because these essential qualities are always things he's talking about having to like build somehow through struggle. And so then, so it's not that different, really. I mean, it's different in some ways. It's different in the fact that he's not a particularly clear, I think he's a very fascinating and rich, but not a particularly clear thinker or writer.
Yeah, no, that totally.
I think I mostly answered your question.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, I'm session. Any other kind of questions, comments, thoughts about sort of things that sort of raised?
I'm wondering, when you say the phrase proto-constructivist, I mean, certainly there's like social constructivism, but then also some other conversations, sort of like a constructivist philosophy of language or something, sort of the idea of constructionist, like logics, like Anil Kawabadia's class recently in this round of seminars was talking about sort of intuitionist logics in computer science and like constructionist. So how are we saying like proto-constructionist or constructivist? You just mentioned that only briefly, so I'm sorry if I'm sort of...
Oh no, it's completely fine. There is probably not a worse person in the world to ask than me about constructionist logics in computer science, or computer science in any kind. What I meant in this conversation was thinking about this more well-known way of thinking about what queer identities were and where they came from that comes out in the 1970s and the 1980s, Foucault and Jeffrey Weeks, and kind of turning away from the first generation of gay liberation scholarship, which those people often classified as being essentialist, right? The idea that, you know, these sort of first claims to gayness being, as I was saying earlier, you know, we've always existed. Look at Da Vinci, look at Michelangelo, look at whoever it was. And then Foucault and Weeks and folks like them are, Gail Rubin, are being much more historicist. And they're saying, no, we actually have to, no, we didn't always exist. No, there's this kind of moment where we start to actually be produced, right? And our production, our discursive production, is a key kind of fact of our oppression, and is a key fact that we have to kind of work through and think about and place into its actual context. And the reason that I'm calling Hay proto-constructionist is because in some ways he anticipates that, because he's making some of the same critiques of the we've always been here folk as Weeks and Foucault will, but then there's obviously this enormous difference where for Hay the construction has to do with very material questions of labor and is not particularly discursive. For Hay, 1870, this kind of mysterious Wendepunkt of the kind of high period of social constructionist sexuality thinking is not particularly important. And so it's constructionist in that it thinks about how identities are constructed out of the ingredients of social life, but it's not precisely constructionist in that like Foucault Weeks way. Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah. You also mentioned like I'm just trying to understand sort of like the sort of like the logics of this sort of proto-constructionist view, like, and maybe it's just a matter of actually sort of going back to like getting a larger understanding of the tradition, but like you also mentioned interaction. Like, is there, and like this kind of like classic idea of like queer intersubjectivity, etc. Like, is there an element to this like construction? I can't remember whether you're saying constructionist or constructivist, but this construction or whatever. Like, is this something that happens maybe in some sense dialectically in like a sort of like linear movement of history, or is it something that arises through some other model of like interaction? And is that interaction purely social? Sorry? Yeah.
And so for Hay, is it dialectical or not? Yes, to some extent, but I don't think Hay sees there as being, it's dialectical, but it's not particularly progressivist in the sense that the vision isn't that it started bad and it's just going to sort of slowly get better. It's more a kind of dance, right, or a kind of unclear path where sort of along this, very much in Hay's head, it's very much mapped to this Engelsian model, where once it was great, then it was bad. Now in the future, it will be good again. So in that sense, it is kind of playing into that thing that Foucault critiques when he's talking about all these, all these kind of essentialist gays who think that tomorrow sex will be good again, and actually sex has never been good. But yeah, so that's kind of, is that answering your question at all? I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I'm fully understanding your question, and that's probably my fault.
No, I mean, I'm pretty unclear on what I mean, but I think that's what I'm looking for. It's like this idea of like not necessarily like a maybe a linear movement, but not necessarily with like a exact destination or predetermined idea of what the destination is.
Yeah. So I need to, unfortunately, hold questions for a little bit because I want to make sure that before we have to go, we get the thing done that we have to get done, which is dividing up the readings. Are all of you planning to be at all of the sessions, or do any of you already know that you may have to miss something? And no one has to miss, no one thinks they have to miss a session. Cool, okay. So there are, let's see, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of you, because there's one of you who isn't here. And let me look at the syllabus 1 second. So next week, I really need presentations and responses on all of these readings, I think, because they're all important in different ways. And then I can talk and then we can have a kind of conversation about everything. So we have 4 readings. The first one is about 1930s anti-racist and queer positive labor union in California. Second one is about gay male flight attendants. The third one is about female masses, but lesbian steel workers and the union. And the fourth one is about kind of the relationship between the U.S. American organized labor movement and U.S. American gay liberation stuff. Do any of you particularly want to do any of those things? And again, I would really love it if we could get all 4 of those assigned, because I would really like to bring stuff out in those. If not, I can assign. I would just rather give you guys a chance to, I'd rather give you guys a chance to pick anything that you would like.
I could do the Frank Miriam piece.
You want to do the Miriam Frank?
Yeah, Miriam Frank, sorry.
Yeah, great. Hold on 1 second. Let me just, cool. Jordan, could I ask you to do the Anne Belay?
Sure, sounds good.
Could I ask you, Sebastian, to do the T-Meyer?
Which one, sorry?
The Phil T-Meyer, the Cold War Gender Order?
Yeah, sure.
Cool.
Okay.
And Sasha, could I ask you to do the Bérubé, the 2 Bérubé ones?
I actually wanted
Would you like to do
to.
something later in the set? Would you rather do something later?
Yeah, I actually wanted to do something later. I wanted to take
Then
Octavia
hold on.
Butler.
We'll get to what you want to do in a second. Sorry, I just wanted to assign the readings on this class first. In that case, Alexei, could I ask you to do the Bérubé?
I would also like to do something session.
You'd like to do something later. William, would you like to do something later, or could you do the Bérubé? You can do the Bérubé? Yes. Great. Hold on 1 second. William is going to do the Bérubé. What the other thing is, you also have to do responses to one of these readings. I'm not going to try to figure that out live right now. I will just assign that to you. Sorry, because I can't. I think if we try to do that right now, it's going to take too much time. So now the only 2 people right now who don't have readings assigned are Sasha and Alexei, and you both wanted to do things. So just pick them now. What do you want to do? Sasha, you want to do?
I wanted to do Octavia Butler for the. Yeah.
Great. 1 second.
Okay.
Sasha is going to do Octavia Butler. Fabulous. And Alexei, what did you want to do?
I want to do xenofeminist future.
You want to do Xenofeminist Futures. Fabulous. Great. Okay, then we're not going to have any presentations on Michelle's section, but I think that's actually okay. So, if anybody has a reading that they want to do the response presentation to, please email me that tonight, and then I will email all of you tomorrow morning a list of all of your presentations and all of your response presentations, and I'll also post that in the Google Classroom. Got it? Cool. So we have.
What are we supposed to do with the readings? We just present the. Sorry, I didn't.
It's in the course handbook.
Oh, it says there. Okay.
It's in the student handbook what the exact kind of requirements for that are.
Okay. I will look it up again.
It's basically a presentation of the main arguments of the reading.
Okay. Okay. So it's a bit, okay.
There's some other kind of components to it. It's all in there.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So, but with the last couple of minutes, I wanted to ask if there's any kind of concluding questions, thoughts, malfunctions on the first.
Ben, I'm really sorry to ask that. It's like it's a bit bad of me to ask, but could you, like, when you present, could you speak a little bit slower? Because you're
all bad of you to ask that. No, thank you for telling me. Yes, of course. I'm so sorry. I will make a note of that.
Yeah, it's just you tend to rush it a little bit, but yeah, please. Thank you so much.
No, thank you for telling me, please. It's not it in the future, by the way. I should have invited you at the beginning. If I'm talking too fast, like, do crazy things with your hands, wave your arms, because the point of this is for you to understand and not for me to just rush through things. So let me know if there's an issue with that.
Okay, yeah. Thanks.
Great. Is there anything, unless there's anything else, I think we can call this particular session to a close and see you next week. And in the meantime, of course, via email or via Google Classroom with further questions. And thank you so much. And also just to say what Sasha just said, please totally feel free. If there's stuff that you thought today didn't work, if there's stuff that you thought today could have been better, if there's moments when you found me hard to understand, please let me know that by email. My feelings are not going to be hurt. This is my first time teaching a seminar in this kind of online context, and there's definitely things that are new about it. And then, of course, you can always learn how to do stuff better. So, like, please let me know if there's something you're not getting, if there's something that really sticks out. I really want to know that, because otherwise, what's the point? I just want to do it better so that it's better for you guys. So, great. Thank you all so much. I'm going to call the meeting to a close. Thanks. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Next week.
Bye.